Hi guys, I'm Dimension Jumper, today reviewing The Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap. Now the story of this game is that Link has to repair this blade called the Bikori blade, which was destroyed by this evil sorcerer called Vati, because Vati is trying to look for this light force, and he's been told, or he's learnt, that it can be found in this chest that's full of monsters, but when he finds out it isn't filled with light force, he basically destroys the Bikori blade and releases all of those monsters onto the world of Hyrule. And it's up to Link to basically repair the Bikori blade and defeat Vati. Now, I think this is an interesting game because it's basically, in the way it's placed in the timeline, it takes place after Skyward Sword. So for those who don't know or who are new to the Zelda series, the Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword takes place at the very beginning of the timeline, and then it's followed by the Minish Cap, Four Swords, Ocarina of Time, and then there's the split. And I think in terms of timeline placement, I think the Minish Cap is a good timeline placement sequel sort of thing, mainly because it takes. I think it does its time well of bringing in no villain until we get Ganondorf and Ocarina of Time, and I think Vati is one of those villains that has a unique design because Vati was a Bikori and he was assistant to this guy called Eslo, who is your constant companion throughout the game, and Eslo was a Bikori himself, but then he got cursed by Eslo and then he becomes Link's bird hat. Well, basically, Eslo talks whenever Eslo's in his cursed form, that when he's a hat, it makes him look like a bird, like a bird talking hat that can be on your head. And I think throughout the interactions that you have with Vati at the beginning of the game, so halfway through the game or something, I can't exactly remember, I haven't played it in a while, and towards the end of the game, I think Vati transformation is quite drastic, which I'll explain later in the review. And also, the Bikori are a new race of people that are basically the size of ants, and it's said that only children can see the Bikori. I think it's if children have pure of heart or something, then they'll be able to see the Bikori, and there's even a whole festival dedicated to them, kind of like how Skyward Sword had a sort of festival thing, because it was the 25th anniversary of the Legend of Zelda series, and they had the whole Loftwing ceremony thing, and yeah, and you get to go to the festival with Zelda, but that leads into the events of the game, and that makes Zelda get turned to stone. And I think that motivates both the Link and the player a lot, because Zelda's one of the most iconic people in the Zelda franchise. It's named after her for a fact, and I think it's quite cool of how you can interact with the Bikori, because the only way to get to the same size as the Bikori is by going to these different stumps or flower pots that have cracks in them, and then your Eslo will perform some sort of magic sort of thing, and that will help you shrink down to the size of the Bikori. And yeah, and they're scattered throughout all of Hyrule. You can find them in the woodlands area, you can find them in the volcanic area, and just a variety of areas of Hyrule. And and this is the only Zelda game to have, or one of the only few Zelda games to have the least amount of dungeons. That's what I'm trying to say. Kind of like how Breath of the Wild did it, and Majora's Mask did it in terms of their dungeons. And I think it kind of makes sense to have this game have one of the least amount of dungeons, because of how the plot's used. Because in order to repair the Bikori blade, you have to collect all of these different elements and just use them to put them back together. And there's even one of the elements, I think it's the last one or the second to last one, in which you have to go to one temple or dungeon, but then you find that the element is not there and it's being put in another one. So you have to go to the second one to get that element. And I think that's quite cool of how they do a good old bait and switch and just make you think you've found all the elements, but in fact you have to go to one extra dungeon and to get that element and repair the Picori blade. Now, the Picori blade itself, I think it's a good sort of one-off blade, because the main well-known sword in the Zelda games is the Master Sword, and I think the Picori blade is a good one-off sword that can be used in the Minish Cap game and also Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures, and it's a blade that can split Link into 4 copies. So in the Minish Cap, it can make ghostly figures of Link, and they can be around for a few seconds or minutes. I think it's around a minute, I think. Whilst in Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures, you can basically do multiplayer, I think, with those games. I'm not too sure, I haven't really played the Four Swords or Four Swords Adventure games. I think it's a nice, cool little blade that you can just use, and yeah. And now it's time for some gameplay of the Minish Cap. Now the gameplay for the Minish Cap is kind of like every other 2D Zelda game. So you basically got your button with your sword attack, which basically just switch about. You can cut grass and stuff just like in other Zelda games. You've got your B button, which basically uses your second item, and also like in a lot of other Zelda games, you've also got a laser beam attack, and if you hold up your sword and just keep charge, you can do a spin attack. And also there are things called kinstone pieces, which are basically this sort of little collectible thing, which can let you go and basically find different secrets around Hyrule. Now, this helps you become small. If you find a tree trunk or tree stump or whatever that has a hole in it, and it will help you grow basically really small. And yeah, and this is kind of a good thing and a bad thing. A good thing is because if you're small, you can basically go into places you couldn't before when you were fully grown. You can climb vines and stuff. But the bad thing is you can't cut any of the bushes and you can't walk past them. So yeah, and also you can find little areas where you can find Picoris. So yeah, I think that's quite cool of how they can see Picoris in various locations around the world. I think that's quite cool. Oh, sometimes that happens. Right. So yeah, I think that's a good way of using the shrinking ability. I think it's a cool way of doing it, and I think the growing and shrinking animation is quite cool because it shows two different contrasts of how Link can grow to different sizes. If you're using the Wii U port thing, if you press the plus button, which is the start, so you can pull up your items area, and if you press left or right, you can basically just view the other areas like the map, and you can basically just see where you are, which areas, basically which areas you can see, and yeah, and also if you want to use the items, you can basically just press A or B. So let's say for this I have the Rock's Cape, and let's say I want to use the bow and arrow. Yeah, so use these items, and then just use them to my heart's content. And also later on in the game you get the arrow, and you can just basically use them. But I would suggest keep your sword in one of your spaces, just so when you are avoiding an enemy or cutting any bushes and stuff to find rupees or hearts or whatever, you can use your sword. And I think with the items, I think for this game, I think it's a good use of items because you got some classic items like the bombs, the bow and arrow, the boomerang, the swords, and the Pegasus boots. You've also got the mole mitts, the roc's cape, and the gas jar, cane of Passy. I forgot how to pronounce that, but yeah. And I do quite like the gas jar and the roc's cape, just because I think they are quite useful in a lot of the areas. For example, the roc's cape, it lets you like fly for a bit, and I think that's good if you want to like get past great distances. And yeah, and also the further you go into the game, the more stronger the enemies will become. For example, in Dark Hyrule Castle, I think there are some like strong enemies in here, like Dark Nuts, and various other enemies. I think can't exactly remember. I haven't played it in a long time. And also for the map, if you go into a dungeon, you can basically just see the specific dungeon map, which I think is quite nice because then you'll basically see where the chests are with the bosses and stuff like that. So yeah, and I think like the enemies get harder when you go and try and defeat Farty, just because, like for this enemy for example, this guy's got like ball and chain, and I think you have to like be very precise of how you're going to beat him. And then for this, you've got like these fox creatures, or fox enemies, and I do like it how you can basically just multiply yourself. Oh no, okay, I think you have to multiply yourself on all of the spaces? Yeah, so, oh, yeah, it can run out at any time, I think if you use like an item or something, like an apart from sword. So, yeah, that's it for the gameplay. Now it's time to go back to the review. Now, the bosses of the game are quite interesting because the game itself takes regular enemies like Octoroks and Choo-Choos and make them like the boss of each temple or wherever you're in. So, for example, in the very first dungeon, the first boss is a giant green Choo-Choo, and I think that's a good boss design because it basically helps you get used to being the size of an ant and trying to fight these enemies that will take a couple of hits to like take down, but it is kind of ruined again when you bring in the electric Choo-Choo as a mini boss, and I think that kind of ruins the charm to the green Choo-Choo boss fight. I think if they kind of replaced the electric Choo-Choo with a different mini boss, that would have been a lot better. But I think the boss fights are quite interesting. Like, you've got the Choo-Choo, or as I said before, you've got the Octoroks, and one of the most probably unique ones and probably most cool ones are these manta ray flying boss thing, in which I think you have to go to each different manta ray and basically hit their eye weakness, like a lot of other bosses do. But this time, I think the main one, the larger one, has multiple eyes in different locations of its body, and I think that's cool because you have to use multiple links in order to hit those certain eyes. And I think more bosses should have been kind of like that in other games, or especially in Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures, and maybe towards the end of the Minish cap, which they did, and could have been cool if they did it with some of the mini bosses. Now Vati, as I said before, has changed throughout throughout the game. So for the first part, you see him in his sorcerer get up. Then I think throughout second part you see flashbacks of him when he was a Picori, and then towards the end of the game you see him change form, quite literally. Not only does he loses Bakori form, but he becomes more of like, wind magey self that you see in both Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures, which is basically this big eye of death. Really, it's basically this giant ball of death with tentacle things and a massive eye weakness thing. And I think the final boss for Vati is quite interesting because Vati finds out that Zelda has the life force, or it's either light force or life force. I can't exactly remember, but yeah, and he basically wants to take the light force from Zelda and use it so he can become more powerful and to basically take over Hyrule and the world. And I think this is like a unique one because unlike other final bosses, you basically have to go up to where Vati is, but you have to get there in 3 bell tolls, because if Vati manages to like ring all 3 bells, he'll basically take the light force out of Zelda, and then that'll be game over. And I think that's quite a challenge because you basically have to fight all of these different enemies. Like you've got Darknuts and various others. And the Darknuts are the only ones I remember. And you basically, in the final boss, basically fight Sand, no, not Sand, he's in Twilight Princess, fight Vati in his, like, I think, his sort of like, before he becomes the big ball of energy eye thing. And I think it's like, a larger version of himself, and then he becomes the eye thing. And I think this boss is quite unique because, like the Manta Ray boss, you basically have to use clones of Link to hit certain parts of his body, which the eyes are at, and then hit the main eye. And I think it's quite unique because it's basically using a lot of elements that you have used throughout the course of the Minish Cap. And I think for my final verdict for this game, I think it's one of those 2D Zelda games that's quite interesting. I think it's like for me personally, I think the Minish Cap is not good, but it's not bad. I think it's somewhere in the middle. There are some good elements, but there are some elements that I'm not quite interested in. Like I kind of wish they improved on some of those elements, like the amount of items you can use. Maybe like if I had to go and making the Minish Cap, I would say 3 items at a time instead of just choosing 2 at a time. So yeah, that's been my review for the Legend of the Minish Cap. I hope you enjoyed that video. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.